Hello everyone, this is Ben, and what we're going to talk about in this video is the question of whether or not evangelism or sharing the message of Jesus, fulfilling the Great Commission, sharing about how people need to believe in Jesus and his death and burial and resurrection, does that do more harm than good? I think most people, most Christians anyway, think that it doesn't, and they think it's worth doing. But this question is a question that can get posed to you, and it's kind of like, as a Christian, you've never thought about it before. It's an argument against, fulfilling the Great Commission. We're supposed to go make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey everything Jesus has commanded, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit. But like with Mormons and with Muslims, you're essentially destroying a family if you succeed. Unless you convert like 100% of everyone you talk to, or even more, because you're not going to talk to everyone in a family, then like you're destroying families, you're probably going to convert certain people and not convert other people. So like, that's just how it's going to go. And it's not going to be you working by yourself. It's always a combination of things, including, but not limited to, the direct action of the Holy Spirit, But so for example, with Mormons, if I know of a story, an example where like the husband converted and became a Christian, and so his wife divorced him for that, and it was perfectly in line with the religious beliefs. I think they officially say that they don't counsel divorce for something like that, but at the same time, it's like, well, she can't go to like the real heaven as long as her husband is not a temple worthy, good, high, good enough Mormon. He has, they both have to be, and she has to be one for him to go to. So like, they'll go to, like, in their belief, everyone will go to, some sort of basically the lowest level of heaven, which will be a really nice place, way nicer than earth, but God will essentially shun you forever. They don't believe that like when you mess up that God's going to work with you to help you overcome your sin. They don't believe that God justifies you before him regardless of what you've done. That they say that God, will always love you, but he won't always accept you. So basically, he'll shun you forever. You'll be shut out from the presence of God in this like other world. So basically they can't complete what they call the plan of salvation. So, in this example with this guy, his wife divorced him over it. So like, you're destroying families. With Muslims, it's worse. Like, they teach that the penalty for someone leaving Islam is they should be executed. Well, that's what the Quran and the Hadith, the sacred texts teach. So, unless they're a really liberal Muslim that like doesn't believe their own documents, then that's where it's really bad. Like, they're definitely going to hell forever, and you should like kill them with you should be really upset about what they did. So that being said, in the past when I've done videos about Mormons and criticizing Mormonism, one of the more interesting responses that comes up a whole lot, maybe the most common response, is why can't I just leave these people alone? Why can't I just let it be? Why do I have to bring this up? And it's like, it's interesting because they're not going to disagree. Here I am trying to say their religion is wrong and mine is right, and they're not going to disagree with that. They're going to just say that I shouldn't be talking about this. So they literally, are asking, me to put my fingers in their ears if I'm going to say, or warn them so they can put their fingers in their ears or something, or just not even say it, put tape over my mouth if I'm going to criticize their thing. So it's like, wow, so, you don't have much confidence in your belief, But, it's interesting, South Park years ago famously did an anti-Mormon episode, and in that episode, basically the conclusion they reached, or really the point that, to sum up their point, their view was that Mormonism is absolutely untrue and silly nonsense in terms of whether or not it's true. But they would add, but it is, you really shouldn't go around telling them that. You should just leave them alone, because they have a really happy life, and just let it go, you know. Because the idea is like, these are really happy families these are like the best families ever, the happiest people ever, and they're living this wonderful life. Why can't you just let it be, you know? David Wood, he's a apologist with Muslims. He says, one of his, the first time he really did evangelism with Muslims, as far as I know from what he says, is with this guy named Nabil Qureshi, who converted and became a Christian. But he said one of the things that struck him and blew him away as he's, evangelizing to this Muslim is like, his family life that he is going to lose if he converts is really, it's a really good, really happy, really wonderful family. And so, like, here's David Wood. He's essentially, he's not a woman, but he is a homewrecker of sorts, and it's this kind of thing, like, are you destroying families with what you're talking about, It could be applied to other situations, the same sort of reasoning, like, for example, I just got through doing, I think, about 5 hours of stuff on Genesis, and I was highly critical of young Earth creationism, and on a lot of points. Highly critical. I mean, basically, I just said they were wrong. Why can't I just leave them alone? Why do I have to be such a meanie pants? Why can't I just let it be? I was watching an episode. I like to watch, it's the same point, but I was watching an episode of this TV show, Stargate SG-1, last night, actually. And there was this girl on there that they discovered on this planet, and she was a robot. And she didn't think she was a robot. She didn't know she was a robot. And two of the characters were arguing, this woman named Daniel, and woman named Samantha, and this man named Daniel. And Daniel said, we gotta not tell her that she's a robot. She can't handle it. The psychological damage will be too great for her to find out she's a robot. But then on the flip side of that, Samantha argued back and said, but if she is a robot, and that's who and what she is, doesn't she have, she has a right to know that. She has a right to that information, These situations come up a lot, where, like, yeah, you're right, and the truth is on your side, but yeah, you should just lie because it's going to do so much damage for you to, tell the truth, to spread the truth. Essentially, the ethics of lying, or lying by omission. And it can apply to a lot of situations. Like, let's say that, there's a closeted homosexual father, in a family. Should you expose that, if you could, would that be wrong? Or should you just let it be? In these moral situations. Okay, so hopefully I've introduced the basic concept here, where what you're saying is true and what you're saying is right, but people argue back with you and say, like, you should just let people be because you're ruining lives, making people so upset, and they would be so much better off and happier if you just, let it be and just let everyone continue believing the lies. And a simple example is really with the Mormons. Within the Mormon Church, you do have people who, like, believe the gospel, because there's a big emphasis on within Mormonism that it's really the same as Christianity, and there's nothing, you know, that really Mormonism just adds to Christianity, things that Christianity's missing, but it doesn't take anything away from the Bible or the New Testament. And so sometimes you have Mormons that will like adopt Christian beliefs to the extent that like basically you'd have to say they're going to heaven, they're saved. But it doesn't. In the cases I've seen, it's like the other Mormons don't agree with that guy, you know, and like they see it as different. And so when you do evangelism with Mormons, I mean, like there's a very good chance that they're not Christians and they're going to hell, because real true Christianity, the gospel, is not going to be coming from their church, but you know, they might read the Bible or debate with Christians, and they're, you know, so there's plenty. I could think of examples where they've like basically become Christians, but they still somehow finagled it in their mind where they're Mormons too. But those are the exceptions, not the rule. So the point is, you're doing evangelism with Mormons, you're sharing the gospel with Mormons, and you could say like, okay, yeah, I'm destroying families, I'm the home wrecker in the name of Jesus Christ. Well, because I'm following the Great Commission. Well, okay. How do you justify yourself? And the point I want to make is really a moral, ethical point about a wrong and a right way to justify yourself. Because essentially, spreading the truth can do damage. And it's easy to get into a justification where you would say, yes, I'm doing damage, but the damage that will happen if I don't spread the truth will be greater. So like for example, in the Mormon or the Muslim example, you could say like, yeah, I'm destroying families, but if I don't share the gospel, then people are just going to go to hell. You know, definitely in the Muslim example, because the Muslim actively teaches against the basic doctrines of Christianity. In the Mormon example too. And that's when I do a video on the Mormon Church. The few times that I have, that's a chronic comment. They're like, "Why can't I just leave it alone?" So my point that I want to make is that sort of justification, where you're saying the ends justify the means, is a bad justification, especially for destroying a family. You know, the kind of damage you're talking about. It's a perfectly legitimate justification for a lot of actions, but not for others. There are situations where it doesn't apply. So for example, it is justified. Like, let's say you want to buy gas and the gas station next to your house charges 30 cents more a gallon. If you drive a little further, they charge 30 cents less a gallon. And so you've got to do the cost benefit analysis, the CBA, and ask yourself like, okay, is it worth it to go a little further, or stay here? And so essentially what you're doing is you're saying, in that situation, the correct action, the right action, is determined by the results of the action. So it's a result or consequentialist, consequences based. You're determining what the correct action is based on what the consequences of the action are. And if the consequences are in one way, then it's bad. If they're in another way, then it's good. Alright, so here's the thing. That's okay with getting gas, but there are certain situations where it's not okay. So for example, the Nazis essentially embrace utilitarianism, which is a consequences-based moral ethical system that says things like, okay, here's what they did. In the 1930s, it's the Great Depression, and it was worse in Germany than, in America. It was really, really bad in Germany. And so when the Nazis had political power, one of the things they did covertly, before they had enough power to go into full steam ahead, they were doing a lot of things in smaller ways, and they ramped up over time. So like one of the things they did was the elderly in nursing homes. They said, okay, people are in poverty. It's the Great Depression. Uh, People don't have enough food. They don't have, enough places to live. Um, Poverty, by the way, is like, just FYI, is the number one killer of humans, period. Because if you're in poverty, it's like it outweighs heart attacks, car accidents, everything is drastically outweighed by poverty, because poverty, everything else is often just a subset of poverty. So like if you're in poverty, you have bad tires on your car, you're more likely to have alcohol problems in your life, and drunk driving and getting in fights, not having proper health care, just all of the problems and the causes of death, and are subsets of poverty. So poverty is killing people. And so what you could do is you could say, like, okay, think of how many lives we could save if we just killed off the unproductive elderly people in nursing homes. And so they did it. Like they would like just kill your grandpa in the nursing home and mail you a letter saying, oh, he had appendicitis and didn't make it. And then you're asking yourself, like, didn't he say he had that when he was a kid? And it's like, man, I thought he did. Maybe he didn't, And it was stuff like that, But they were justifying it based on a utilitarian justification. I can give you a hypothetical example, or what in ethics is called a thought experiment, of the doctor problem. Here's another example, of utilitarian ethics. Here's the doctor problem. So, like, in the doctor problem, you're a medical doctor, and let's say that you have one patient. You've got 5 patients. You've got one patient who has some sort of brain problem. I don't know enough about medicine to like come up with one, but he's got, this guy's got some sort of brain problem, and he's at best he's going to make it 2, maybe 3 years. Okay, and then over here down the hall you've got 4 patients who all are young, in their 20s, and they each need an organ. And that's the only problem they have. They just need one organ. And if you get them that organ, they'll live 60, 70 more years. Okay? And this guy over here, but they need those organs right away. They're not going to be able to wait 2, 3 years for this guy to die so you can harvest his organs. But let's say that his organs he's a possible donor for all 4 of those other patients. That would work. Do you execute that one patient because his 2, 3 years, you're doing the cost-benefit analysis, and you're saying, here I have, 4 people over here, and they're combined, I don't know, 4 times 60, 200, what is that, 240 years, versus his 2, 3 years. It's better off, the results justify, that's utilitarianism, causes the greatest number of good for the greatest number of people. Okay, and see, utilitarianism essentially is saying, doing a cost-benefit analysis, and like, while that's okay to do with something like gasoline, when you start talking about murder, like a doctor murdering patients, that's a totally different situation. Okay, and there are, the Nazis were utilitarians. I think Jeremy Bentham is a famous utilitarian. So that's really touching. That's really hitting at why I say, whenever you argue and disagree and point out why someone is wrong, especially the more you learn about apologetics and the more you learn about truth, and the more you know, the smarter or the more knowledgeable you are, the wiser you become, the more cognizant you have to be of the fact that, like, your knowledge, if you spread it to other people, can do damage. Okay? And there's certainly times where it's just like, let it be, let it go, especially like with something like politics, it's not so clear that like I need to like, pick a fight with this person over this because it's not going to matter one way or the other. Does it really matter? Maybe it does in some situations, but maybe not on every particular issue. Maybe just let some stuff go, when it comes to evangelism, it's like, well, we've got a direct command from Jesus to make disciples of all nations, you know. So let's go back to the doctor problem. All right. The problem with the utilitarians and utilitarian ethics and the doctor problem, one of the many problems is that, well, one of the problems is that it's easy to get sucked into that way of thinking and assume that utilitarianism is the correct ethical system, and then merely argue your position on utilitarian grounds. So like in other words, like, let's say you're going around and you're spreading the gospel to Mormons, and you're wrecking families, and they argue with you about the results of your action and the harm you're causing, and then you respond with like, well, there's more damage if I don't do this. Okay. In the case of evangelism and people going to heaven and hell, utilitarianism is not a good enough justification. And especially wrecking families, I mean, that's getting into, it's a sin to wreck families. God doesn't want you to wreck families, destroy families, you know. So like, I don't know that that's really a good justification. So back to the doctor problem, you know, like, one of the problems with the utilitarians is what they're doing is they're saying, all right, these 4 people, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then their combined 240 years versus this one person's 2 or 3 years. And what they're doing is they're doing the math there. One of the problems with that is, like, you have to ask yourself, well, how valuable is each individual human life? Okay. Well, if it is true that each individual human life is of infinite value, then essentially you're just comparing infinite value of this one guy to infinite value of these 4 guys, and it's all the same. They all have infinite value. And then, so what you do cannot be determined by one, a group of people, younger people, being more valuable than some other guy with a brain problem. He doesn't, he's not less valuable. So then the question becomes, like, what do you do? Well, see, the thing is, utilitarianism isn't the only ethical system, and that's kind of the point I'm trying to make here, is it's easy to get sucked into sometimes when someone's trying to argue with you, to, like, argue and say, well, no, the cost of me not spreading the truth, or even worse. And while that may be the right thing to do in some situations, it's important to understand that utilitarianism is not the only ethical system. So, like, for example, there's Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian, but there's also Immanuel Kant, the deontologist. Immanuel Kant would say that actions are moral or immoral based on duty. That, in other words, like, we have moral duties, so, like, we just have to do the correct thing because it's the correct thing. And it's the results don't matter. It's about doing the right thing. So, like, for example, in the example of, like, buying gas, the results matter. But in the example where you just have a moral duty just to not murder people, then you just have to not murder people. And that, because it's just wrong to do, so you just don't do it, would be Kant's position. So he's a deontologist. He disagreed with the utilitarians. He would say, no, just because good will result, like, you just don't do bad things because they're bad things. He would say that, like, doing the good deed has value in and of itself. That, like, that it's not like we're doing something to cause something else good, but rather some things are just good at step 1 or bad at step 1. There is no result that, like, so I mean, that is one of the basic flaws with utilitarian thinking. They're always looking at the results of actions, but that buck has to stop somewhere, and at somewhere you have to get to something that just possesses value, and there's no later result that makes that action correct or incorrect. If it's eventually it gets, to something like, okay, you saving 4 lives just has value. And it's like, okay, well, if something can just have value, then maybe not murdering can just have value. Why, that's at least possible, right? So the big question, I guess, for Christians is like, well, where does God stand on these moral debates, these ethical debates? Essentially, when it comes to God, when you bring God into the picture, it changes the situation quite a bit, because now you've got to say, all right, God is an all-knowing, all-powerful being, and I am clearly not. And you can know because if you were all-powerful and all-knowing, there's no way you wouldn't know that you were all-powerful and all-knowing. So therefore, you can know that you're not, because if you were, you would definitely know. I never forget when I was a little kid and I was 6 years old, and the first time my father took me fishing that I can remember, and there was a strong current in the creek, and I kept thinking maybe there was a fish on my line, because I would feel tugs and pulls, and I kept saying, "Daddy, is there a fish on the line? Is there a fish on the line? I think there's a fish on the line, but I don't know." And then he just said to me, "Son, if there's a fish on the line, you'll know." Just like that. And I just remember thinking about that. Like, that really struck me. I thought, like, I can't know that there's not one, but I can know that there definitely is one. And so if I don't know whether there's one or not, then there's definitely not one. So I guess I always know. Okay. Like, that blew my mind. Then a snake came up and sat down beside us, and Daddy beat it to death with a stick. That's what happened. But when it comes to God, God knows everything. Whereas we are much more like me, the 6-year-old kid who doesn't know if there's a fish on the line. So, here's the thing. Let's say, they did this on one of the Star Trek movies, where Dr. McCoy pulled the plug on his father, who was being kept alive on these machines because he was in pain with some disease, future space disease, and he couldn't save him. And his father, said, "Please, please, please, just let me die, son." And so he did. And then McCoy said that the next week or something, they found a cure, a literal cure for the disease. He could have been cured. And so there is this question of we as humans don't really know what the results of our actions will oftentimes be. We just don't know. You don't know what's going to happen. If the Nazis had known that the results of the way they were running the government would lead to the deadliest war in human history, maybe they would they would have they didn't know that was going to happen, right? Or maybe they were okay with it, but you could see what I'm saying. We as humans, we don't actually know what's going to happen. So back to the doctor problem. When you say that this guy's going to live 2 or 3 years, you're saying that provisionally, based on my experience, that is what probably will happen, given that there is not some unknown factor that I do not know about. Because surprises do happen. Just like with these other 4 people in the organ transplants, there could be some problem with the donor that you didn't know about ahead of time, and there's always a chance that organ transplants fail. Those are risky. It's all risky. We're taking risks. We don't know. We're just playing the probabilities. So here's the point. God does know what will happen. And so if God says you just do X, then you have to leave the overarching plan of the results in God's hands, and just obey the guy who has the plan maker. So God could do things, it would be different for God than for us, essentially, because God could know, like, well, if I do this, this is going to be the result, and that's going to be the result. So, like, God could totally, like, ends justify the means, because, like, God could know things that we can't possibly know. But in our case, we don't really know what the results of our actions will be. And the being that does know everything says, what I want you to do is, like, never murder. Okay? So, like, if God says, make disciples of all nations, then you make disciples of all nations. Okay. Because ultimately, only God knows the outcome. We don't know the outcome. We don't know the outcome of our actions. So, like, back to the doctor problem, you would just say, God says not to murder people, so you just don't murder people. It's just wrong to do. And if God, who knows the outcome of everything, just says don't do it, then, like, because if you start playing a results question, it could be like, here's a different way of thinking about utilitarianism. You got a seesaw, and on one side is a convicted rapist and a murderer, and on the other side is a kindergartner. Who is more valuable? Do you base your decision on what they have done or what they may possibly do? What if the kindergartner is baby Hitler? Okay. We all like, kill Hitler, like, in other words, like, we don't know. We don't really know. And the being that does know just says you do X, Y, and Z, and you leave the results in God's hands, and you just obey God, because only God really knows the outcome. It's just like Romans 8:28 says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for the good of those that love Him and are called according to His purpose. So, all things working together, like, is pretty broad, vague statement. We can't possibly know how that is. But essentially what God's saying is the results are really in my hands. The results are really in my hands. What I've told you to do is obey and let God be in control of the results. So, like, in life, a lot of the time we control the results, and there's no direct command from God, that you directly always have to do this or never do this. And so you can think about the results, and it's perfectly ethical and moral. But in situations where it's like, no, God said never do this or always do this, then it's a little bit different. So, like, because ultimately God could snap His fingers, and all of those people that needed, the young 20-year-olds that needed the organs, could die. They could die tomorrow in a car accident. God is the one who is actually in control of what happens. God could snap His fingers and cause your brain not to function as the doctor and prevent you from doing anything that you intend to do. You could go insane. You could get hit in the head and have, basically become mentally handicapped. So what actually, here's the point. In the end, what actually physically happens is always under God's control. And God is going to see to it that those things that happen are for the good of those that love Him and are called according to His purpose. Okay? He's called, He wants everyone, But how exactly God's plan works so that it's all good, we don't know. But since God's really in control of the results, then in situations where He's directly told us to do something, we just do it and we let Him worry about the consequences. Because ultimately, He's the one who really controls consequences. In situations where we don't have a direct command, from God, then we can worry about consequences on our level that we know as best we can, and we can say, if the Lord wills it, then we'll go here and save 10 cents or 30 cents a gallon. um, Now, even when it comes to evangelism, it's still more complicated than that, because it's like, well, evangelism, I could say, I'm not the only one that's witnessing to this person. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that anything you say evangelistically is something you have to say. You have to beat people over the head with the Bible, I wouldn't necessarily say that. But you have to at least have some sort of agenda to fulfill the basic command that Christ has given to make disciples of all nations. So anyway, there's that. I don't know if I can really add anything to that. I think I'll just stop there. So I hope everyone understood what on earth I was talking about. Thank you for your time. So once again, I've got to come back in with some additional things that I realized after recording that. I think it would be a good idea for us, now that we've sort of laid the groundwork, introduced the idea, argued the main point, let's think about some application. Why don't we think about how this applies to different situations, what we've talked about so far. So we'll look at some hypothetical situations, imaginary TV situations, and maybe also real life situations. So maybe, let me get some notes here, just double check them, make sure I don't forget anything. But yeah, okay, yeah, a couple things. All right. So anyway, let's go back to that example I was talking about from Stargate SG-1. This is how it went down. They discovered a young girl. She essentially is a robot that had the mind of a child. A young child, apparently, although it seemed to be in the body of like a teenage girl. And so everyone has their different suggestion about, the robot thinks that she is just a human. So MacGyver comes in and he says, what difference does it make what we tell her? Because the question is like, should we tell her that she's a robot? And MacGyver's like, who cares what you tell her? Tell her whatever you want. It doesn't matter. What you tell it's a robot. And then Daniel Jackson responds and he says, no. We gotta, it's a life form. He's come to that conclusion. It's a life form with the same rights as a human. And so, she shouldn't be harmed in this way by being told that she's a robot. That'll devastate her psychologically and mentally. So you can see how this is very similar to the situation we're talking about with evangelism. It's like, yeah, I could tell people about Jesus, but it'll devastate their family, psychologically, mentally. You're basically a homewrecker in the name of Christ, but you just happen to be correct. And Islam or Mormonism just happen to be incorrect, but that's not important, or that's the argument here. And so that's the argument he was making. Well, then you have Samantha, and she responds back, and she's with Daniel that, like, yeah, this girl should be treated with the same rights as a human, but then the question becomes like, she is a robot and she doesn't know it. And so Samantha's point is like, she has a right to know the truth about what she is. So that's really the point we're talking about. Like, there are some things that are just wrong. It's like it's wrong to keep from someone what they are. Now, this notion of human rights is actually something that comes from Christianity, to the best that I understand it. It's a Christian thing. So, like, in the ancient world, sort of pre-Christian, you didn't have rights unless you were nobility and royalty. And what Christianity did is they moved everyone into the most noble family of all, And so then everyone has to be treated like royalty. So in other words, like what Galatians 3 says is that we're all children of God. Why don't I just read it? So Galatians 3 makes the point that we're all children of God, and so the point then would be that, like, well, you can't be in a possibly any more noble family than that. Galatians 3. So that's the essence of the point that I'm making. And that's where, the idea of human rights comes from. As best I understand it, the general consensus is that in India, they almost developed an idea of human rights, but they never did. They did develop an idea of human responsibility. And the distinction is that in India, it was like you had responsibility, not to oppress someone or enslave someone, but that person didn't have a right to freedom. So it was like kind of giving something with one hand and taking it back with the other, because it's like essentially you had this idea of karma, where it's like anything bad that happens to someone is because of something they did bad in this life or in a past life. So the worst thing you could do for that person is free them from, say, oppression or slavery or their bad situation. So they would say, that it's wrong of you to enslave someone or oppress someone, but once someone's already in that situation, it's also wrong of you to free them from it. So it's kind of like a loophole way to just change nothing and improve nothing, like a workaround. So anyway, we shall read the passages in question. All right. Before the coming of this faith, we were held in custody. This is Galatians 3:23. Custody under the law, locked up until the faith that was to come would be revealed. So the law was our guardian until Christ came, that we might be justified by faith. Now that faith has come, we are no longer under our guardian. So in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith, basically adopted. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. And then this erases all of the all of the distinctions. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and, importantly, heirs, according to the promise. That's God's promise to Abraham. You're an inheritor. So, like, by being an heir, that means you're treated like a prince, like royalty, like nobility, because you actually have an inheritance in the family. Well, this is God's family. Okay, so that's the idea there. And so, like, the idea of human rights developed, like, okay, what rights should a person have as a child of God? And, it seems kind of obvious when you think about it. It's like, okay, if you're not going to tell this girl, this robot girl, that she is a robot, then, and it could be a different situation. We don't have to think about a sci-fi situation. It could just be that, like, somebody is adopted, they don't know they're adopted, and their real parents are, like, terrible people, serial killer, rapist, murderers. And they just, does that child have a right to know that? When they're old enough and, of age as an adult, does that child have a right to know that? Yeah. Because that's who you are and that's your family, and you can think of it in another way. It's like, who do you think you are to think that you can deal with the truth, but this other person can't? It's quite arrogant. That's the arrogance of lying, to think, the truth isn't too much for me to handle, but so and so can't handle the truth. So and so is not tough as me, or not as smart as me. I know this truth and I'm dealing with it, but you can't deal with it. And for a child, yeah, but like once that person's an adult, you need to get off your high horse. Let's take a look at a different situation. Jimmy Swaggart is a fairly famous name of a TV preacher, what's called a televangelist or televangelist. And so in the 1980s, cable TV became a thing, and then cable TV preachers became a thing. There was an expansion of TV channels, and so like, yeah, it didn't have the reach that network television had, because when I was little, we didn't have cable TV. We had an antenna, and I remember at my daddy's house, like, if we wanted to watch, we basically had CBS, ABC, and NBC, and PBS. And on Sunday afternoon, you could pick up TBS, and then like in the early '90s, they added Fox, and like whatever channel you wanted to watch, there was like a thingy, and you would turn the thingy, and like point it to the north to get so like you pointed it towards Macon, to pick up CBS, point it towards Augusta. You can tell I live in Middle Georgia now, but like and like to pick up the different channels. And at my mother's house, it was the same way. The only difference there was that if you're in town, it's like a lot easier to pick up the stations. And it wasn't until the '90s when I got cable TV at my mother's, basically in the early '90s, and then at my father's house, we didn't get cable. We got dish, satellite, whatever they called it, direct TV. Like, I want to say maybe 95, somewhere in there. Maybe 94. So yeah, we went up. It might have been 96. No, it could. Yeah, it could have been 96. It easily could have been 96. But like, cable TV came to a lot of other people in the 1980s. So even though a lot of people like me didn't have cable TV till much later, it doesn't mean that there weren't still lots and lots of people who had cable TV. So there was this huge new market of basically TV, the ability to be on TV that didn't exist before. When you just had 3 channels and PBS, all of a sudden you can be a TV preacher, and you can have all sorts of TV channels through cable, because once you have cable, it's like you can do lots more channels than just the 4. And so you have TV preachers, and they basically become a very, very big deal. They become very wealthy. They have tremendous ratings and followings, not compared to other shows, but for preachers it was huge. And so in Jimmy Swaggart's case, their ministry got, and their church and their whole thingy, it got so big that they were actually going to open a theme park, like a Disney World for Jesus type thing. So it was a massive operation. I think their TV show was called Praise the Lord, actually. And I think there's another TV show that's called Praise the Lord that's on Trinity Broadcasting Network that's like not affiliated with them. So the thing is, Jimmy Swaggart was like cheating on his wife and sleeping around. He was sexually promiscuous. He was an adulterer on a fairly chronic, regular basis. But that's not the whole story. So think about it. You've got this guy. He's a pastor of this church, TV pastor. Televangelism is this new exploding thing. They're making tons of money. Their church is huge. There's a lot of people who work there. There's a lot of people coming to God through this ministry. And the pastor is a massive adulterer behind the scenes, and nobody knows about it. Okay, he's very sly and very cautious, and so then that's not the whole story. That's not the whole introduction to this story. There's one more important point of introduction. His style of preaching and sort of the whole, shall I put, the whole vibe of his ministry, the whole emphasis maybe of his ministry, is condemnation of sin with furious emotion and anger. And he's like one of the prophets of the Old Testament, throwing rocks, condemning sin, condemning sin, condemning sin, condemning sin, standing outside and throwing rocks. How dare you? These sins have to stop. These sins have to stop. These sins have to stop. How long will America not repent of its sins? And the sins that he was committing were the sins that he was most virulently and emphatically and angrily denouncing from the pulpit. And that wasn't just something he did every once in a while. It was the cornerstone basis of what his ministry was all about. So, people are coming into his ministry like buying into what he's selling, that like what essentially that like we're here to have this preaching and this message to change people and to get people to stop sinning and to get America to stop sinning. And it's going to be through what we're doing. He's their leader. He's the leader, and they're following his lead. They're his disciples, and they're buying into his whole mission and his whole project of condemning sin and changing America. Okay, that was basically the vibe of what he was doing. And so now let's get to how he got exposed. So he did get exposed, and it's a rather interesting story. There was another competitive televangelist who was also doing well, but I think not as well, who was in a very similar boat. But not as big, but still preaching one thing and hypocrisy, living a life of adultery and promiscuity behind the scenes. And so I can't remember exactly how it goes down, but somehow, if I remember correctly, Jimmy Swaggart found out and got the evidence, or somehow he had the ability. He knew the truth about his competitive pastor, who was absolutely a financial competitor. They were making a lot of money. They weren't selling tickets to come to church, but the appeal of your ministry brings people in, and they become your followers. You have a following, and then they donate, and you're making millions of dollars. So millions of dollars are on the line because of cable TV and televangelism. These guys are absolutely financial competitors. Jimmy Swaggart gets the dirt on his competitor. So then his competitor, if I remember right, his competitor's son gets the dirt on Jimmy Swaggart too. Turns out he's doing the same thing, going off to his mistress or something, like that, and they get photos of him. So then they have a sit-down meeting, and they agree to not expose one another because, if one of them goes, they both go. Then Jimmy Swaggart just double-crosses and exposes the other guy anyway. So then the other guy says, all right, then I'm going to expose you. And so then there was the very famous clip of Jimmy Swaggart after the expose happens, and it's like huge news across America. There's the famous clip of him crying and emotionally apologizing to God in a sort of a preaching prayer. He has his eyes open, whatever. But like that then in turn becomes really an apology to his followers. And as best I understand the story, his ministry didn't really take any sort of hit from that happening. He just continued on. They kind of bought the apology. So then what happened was he took a trip, I think, to Arizona for his anniversary, and his wife stayed at the hotel while he just slipped away just to run an errand, when in reality he just went and just met up with a prostitute on his anniversary trip vacation with his wife. And he got pulled over with the prostitute in his car, and like a playboy in the seat of the car, and he was just wearing like a sweatsuit with like some big Ray-Ban glasses, you know, and he got pulled over. Um, and so there had to be, I don't know why, but I think like because he got pulled over and there's a prostitute in the car, if I remember right, I don't know if there was like alcohol too or something, but essentially it became a matter of law. He was breaking the law meeting up with a prostitute. So like uh I think he got in legal trouble and so he got exposed. No one was really trying to out him. He just got exposed in this way. And the officer didn't even know it was him at first. Um so then the second expose happened, and that severely severely affected his following. He continued on, but I think they had to get rid of their TV program. They couldn't afford the money it cost to run that. It was bringing in more money than they were spending, but not anymore. And then they had to abandon the theme park, and their church, which was huge, drastically underwent a drastic reduction in numbers. But he didn't have to just stop. He was able to continue on, but it dramatically decreased his following. Like it was a huge loss. So then the question becomes like, okay, let's think about this Jimmy Swaggart situation. Let's say let's start thinking about it hypothetically. Let's say you were there and you had the ability to expose this man. Would it be immoral of you to do so, to expose this man? Would you be wrong for exposing this man? Because you can think about what will okay, if you expose this man, then like the benefit will be the people will know the truth. They'll no longer be lied to by this hypocrite. Okay. That's the benefit. What's the cost of exposing this man? Well, you'll probably have to take photos, you have to get the film developed. And back in the 80s, there's no 1 hour photo development like they had later on. So, you're going to be spending, a good 10, you want good photos, you might have to spend a lot more. You might have to hire a photographer. You might be spending a few $100. So, you have to do the math there. So, so anyway, the the cost will be the reduction of his ministry because people were really getting saved, coming to Christ through this ministry. A lot of people's livelihood, a lot of people, like a massive amount of people are just on staff there, and they're going to have to leave. They're going to lose their job. It'd be like, it's not all that different than if, like, let's say you worked for the Environmental Protection Agency and there's a mining company or some sort of manufacturing plant that's like polluting the environment, and a lot of people are going to lose their job because they're massively breaking the rules, and so you could feel guilty about doing your job at the EPA for exposing them because all these people are going to lose their job in this massive company that does a lot of good for the world. Can't you look the other way? So that's the kind of point here. It's like the too big to fail thing. Once evil gets so big, then there's a lot of good that's dependent on it, and that's always the case. That you're never not in that situation. So then it just can't fail. Of course, evil empires have fallen. Oh my goodness, they have. If you look back in human history, but that would be the argument, and especially people are actually like coming to Christ. Like getting saved through this ministry. And then on the flip side of that, like you've got like a lot of people who were kind of teenagers in that period or in their 20s in that period. I've listened to them or even known some people who are around that age, basically people who are like 5-10 years older than me. And they were like teenagers in the 80s or maybe in their 20s in the 80s. And like I've known people in my life. I've seen celebrities talk about it who are that age, in interviews. They'll talk about why they're an atheist, and then they'll explain, well, this is what religion is and this is what church is, and then they will absolutely uh, link it to those events of TV evangelists. Like, that led to their atheism according to their own personal testimony. So now, not only are, so, there's people that are coming to Christ through this ministry. That's going to stop because the ministry doesn't exist anymore. But also, some people are going to be actively pushed away from Christ because of this ministry. So think of all the damage that you're doing. Why can't you just let it go? Yes, this man's sleeping around. Well, we can think about it, in terms of, from a deontological perspective, and like what we talked about. It's like, well, you have to do the right thing that God commands, and if God says you have to do X, then you have to do X, and God's the only one that's really in control of the consequences, because you don't really know what's going to happen, and you don't really even know what really was the result of this guy's ministry. Really, like, these people who became atheists, maybe they would have been atheists anyway, or like, or these people who didn't come to Christ through the ministry. Well, maybe they came to Christ through some other ministry. Is the Lord really going to leave himself without a witness? Is he going to send somebody or something to everyone? So I mean, there's that. How do you put it? Like Paul says, Paul is in the Bible, in numerous places in the New Testament, says, hey, there's people out there who they just preach the gospel of Jesus for their own personal gain to make money. And it's a travesty, but I am happy that people are coming to Christ through that. Well, you could say, well, okay, Paul's justifying it. Well, no, because think about it. Like, when Paul says they're out there just doing it for money, in the context of those books, if I remember right, the people he's writing to would have known who he's talking about. So he's essentially exposing them in that, at the same time. But we can think about it from a basic human right. Like, okay, the members of his church donate money to this church, and then the church has a budget, and the members of the church, whoever runs the church, manages that budget. And so essentially he's the employee as the pastor of the members of his church. And, well, his personal life is part of his job description. So, like, it's not like when Bill Clinton got caught, cheating on his wife, and America essentially kind of came to the conclusion that it's like, well, whether or not, the president cheats on his wife is not really part of his job description. We feel like he can still do his job as president, just because, once upon a time, the marriage vows were taken much more seriously, but in America today they're taken more lightly. So, if he says he's married to so-and-so, no one takes that as seriously. So it's not as much of a betrayal because it's not taken as much of a promise, in general across America. Of course, and that doesn't mean that everybody sees it that way, but you can't assume that just for everyone that, runs for office, that they take it as sacred. So, because the general consensus in America, the general prevailing view is that divorce is just fine. Even if you believe that it's not, and you go with the Bible, most Americans still think it is. So it's not that way for Jimmy Swaggart, because these people are Bible readers, and they believe that they have a duty to select leaders and to follow leaders and to not follow false teachers, because the Bible tells you not to follow false teachers, and to have leadership in their churches who are properly capable of leading them in obeying Christ, following Christ, obeying the teachings of Christ, being loyal to Jesus, and, abiding in Christ. And this man, is he qualified to lead you in these things? No. No, he is not qualified. Because he doesn't know how to do it. So essentially, it's like this. It's like, let's say that you live on the other side of the world and you buy a house over here in America, and you want to flip it or improve it, and it needs rewiring. So you hire an electrician, and the electrician rewires it's supposed to be rewiring the house. Only one problem: he doesn't know anything. He doesn't know what a wire is. He doesn't know what an outlet is. He doesn't know the difference between AC and DC current. He doesn't even know how to write the word electricity. He hasn't rewired one thing, and you're over here mailing him checks and paying him. You have a right to know that you're being ripped off, okay? Because he's not actually doing his job. And from a biblical view, this guy, this Jimmy Swaggart is not actually doing his job. He's being paid to do a certain job. He's not actually doing it. From a biblical view, anyone that comes to Christ is coming to Christ through God's providence. Just like in the book of Genesis, Joseph tells his brothers, because they're very worried that when their father dies, that Joseph is going to have them put to death because they sold him into slavery and left him for dead, and that kind of thing. And they think he's going to hold a grudge. And Joseph says, you guys meant it for evil, but God used it for good to actually save our entire family, because they would have all starved to death in the long run if they hadn't done that. But that wasn't their intention. So they were actively trying to do the opposite, yet God, through God's guiding hand and providence, still brought salvation. So it's important to give credit where credit is due. From a biblical perspective, someone who is an extreme hypocrite like this, who isn't practicing anything he preaches, is not capable of leading people to Christ. Doesn't understand what he's talking about. Okay. It's like an electrician who doesn't know the difference between AC and DC current, doesn't know what a transformer is, doesn't know what a circuit breaker is, doesn't know the difference between 12 gauge wire and 16 gauge wire, which would be really important. Okay. Doesn't even know where to buy the wire. Okay. But from a biblical perspective, even when someone is actively trying to lead people to evil, God can still work through that to bring salvation. So, like in Jimmy Swaggart's case, is he really qualified from a biblical view of leading people to Christ? Leading people to follow Christ to morally. So let's just take a look at it. Alright. Matthew 7 is a good place to start. Okay. It says, it's at chapter 7 verse 1, it says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." Now, as Michael Heiser puts it, we're going to have the profound insight of how to interpret this verse by reading some more. Okay? Have this profound wisdom for you. Okay? "For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." So that, makes the point. Like, Jesus is making an analogy here that, like, you're not qualified to clean up the sins of someone else when you do the same things. You need to have, sins fall into different categories and different struggles. But, like, whatever the thing is you're trying to help that person with, you need to not be struggling with it yourself. Okay, so, like, before you're going to, be the cleaner-upper of the other person. So Jesus is not saying don't judge people. He's saying don't judge people until you've got yourself cleaned up. Okay, so, like, the metaphor here, if Jimmy Swaggart's going to tell people that they shouldn't be cheating on their wives, or he would tell people they shouldn't even look at a television program that promotes that when he's actually doing it massively behind the scenes. Well, okay, Jimmy Swaggart, you have a board in your eye. How can you remove the speck from your congregation's eyes? But your congregation is literally paying you to help them remove their specks. That's your job. You are unqualified to do your job. Specks are getting removed because in the work of God and in the work of God's kingdom, God is going to see to it that things are done. But at the end of the day, and we talk about human rights, just like the robot girl has a right to know she's a robot, don't the people who are hiring you to do your job have a right to know that you're not doing your job? That you're not even qualified to do your job? That you don't even know how? That you couldn't possibly be doing your job? Okay, so anyway, that makes the point, I guess. It could apply to different situations, but there you have it. Basic point: God is in control. Therefore, we have a obligation to do what God says, regardless of the consequences, because ultimately the consequences are always really in God's hands. God can make anything happen at any time. There can be a bullet flying at your head and God can stop it. Okay? So there are no certain consequences when it comes to what you think versus what God thinks. It's always God knows and you don't. Okay? So if it comes down to something that God says you have to do X or you can't do it, you can't do Y, then that's that. Okay? And it's not about, weighing the cost versus the benefits. Okay, so anyway, yeah, and, let God be God. Let God be God. Who is God if not God? Just because there's good things coming from someone's ministry doesn't mean that, that's them doing that. From a biblical view, they could be actively pursuing evil and God could still bring salvation from it for many people. Okay, so that's a basic biblical point. That God is in control. That these people, Joseph's brothers, were literally trying to make his life as bad as possible, and they ended up, because God is the one who's really in control, they ended up putting him in the highest position of royal power they possibly could. They ended up saving themselves and untold countless numbers of people from starvation. They weren't trying to do any of those things at all. But they still wound up, their actions led to those results. So therefore, the results are in God's hands. So if God says not to do something, you just trust God. Or if God says do this, you just trust God. So anyway, that is the point. Thank you for your time and attention.